Costs are what they are. They're still, renewable energy by and large is still more expensive than some of our traditional sources, but that's changing really, really quickly. Solar, for example, came down with 30% in cost just last year, and expected to drop with 30% again this year. So some of the costs are changing really, really quickly. In fact, in Alberta, I was just on the phone 2 days ago with the independent power producers of Alberta, and basically saying that wind power is becoming almost the technology of choice in Alberta because it's going to be more cost-effective to develop wind than to develop new coal in Alberta. So the costs are coming down quickly. Financing is a big issue, even for developing technologies that are profitable. Getting banks to lend you the money because the financial institutions are still somewhat uncomfortable with these technologies, how they work, how you finance them. Getting onto the grid, interconnecting to the grid. Some of these systems interconnect to the distribution grid, which is a fair bit different than interconnecting to the transmission grid. And so some of the issues with interconnection can be a problem. There can be bottlenecks in terms of having grid tied up for other development. That's certainly the case in Ontario, where we have transmission lines that are dedicated to nuclear power. Even though the plant hasn't been built yet, the transmission lines have been dedicated to nuclear power, and so some of the opportunities for renewables to get online are being bottlenecked by that. And then just access information in terms of how the technologies and how the opportunities work. So those are some sort of common barriers, and I think they're common to development, whether it's at a large scale or whether it's at a rural, remote scale. But I think there's some acute problems for remote and rural communities. The financial capacity in small communities obviously is much more constrained than in large communities or for large developers. Local ownership opportunities, and sometimes there just isn't the right infrastructure in small communities to actually take possession of something. We had a problem in Tuckeyuptuck. We've been working on a wind farm in Tuckeyuptuck. And the government of the Northwest Territories actually put in a whole bunch of money to get the project up and running, and they're putting in the foundations as we speak. But the problem was there wasn't an institution in Tuck that could actually own the wind farm. The hamlet couldn't own it. They didn't want to become a utility, and so we had a project that was going to make money. There was no one there that could basically have it land on their lap, and so that actually just became a big barrier. Even though we had a renewable energy project that everyone wanted, and then it had the money and the finance behind it, but there wasn't anyone that actually knew how to own or operate it. And the utility didn't want anything to do with it. So it was an interesting problem that I don't think is unique to Tuckeyuptuck. Human capacity can be a problem, particularly in remote communities where you've got limited training, and the people that, when they get trained, often leave. Or in a lot of the remote communities, they're fairly flexible with people. They sort of come and they go, and they're there for a year, and they're into other communities. And so keeping people around is an issue. Logistics, as I said, you can imagine that importing all of your diesel fuel in 1 year, or depending on winter roads, just the logistics of getting this equipment to rural communities, or remote communities in particular, that in and of itself is a challenge. And then the economies of scale are obviously a big issue, because a big wind farm is obviously more economic than 1 or 2 small wind turbines. So those, I think, are some challenges that are unique and acute in remote and rural settings. So the other thing we looked at in the study was the different types of policies that governments can use to facilitate this development. And so there's capital cost grants, where basically you help to pay down or help to give rebates to development. This seems to be the most common policy in sort of a smaller scale type development, where the government will step in and give a 30% rebate or a 20% rebate or a tax credit for development. In Canada, anyway, that's the one we see most commonly for sort of smaller scale development. There's incentives that are linked to production, and so you get incentive based on how much power you produce. And so a feed-in tariff is the model that Germany, Denmark, and Spain have already used, and the UK has recently adopted. That's the model that Ontario was just put into place in its Clean Energy Act. And what that is basically guaranteeing a certain rate for renewables, guaranteeing basically passing that cost onto the ratepayers. It's not a taxpayer subsidy, but the ratepayers basically pick up the additional cost. Standard offer contracts are similar to feed-in tariffs, and then that production incentive. And this is what the federal incentive was in Canada traditionally, where it was basically a taxpayer 1 cent a kilowatt hour incentive. So those types of incentives are all linked to production. So you don't get the money unless you actually produce. Whereas the capital cost incentive, as long as you build it, you get the money. It doesn't actually have to run. So you can see there, in some ways, there's benefits to both. Other policies are training people, technical assistance, whether it's energy planning, whether it's just literacy, whether it's learning software like RedScreen, which is developed in NR10. So that's obviously important in terms of just getting the literacy up there. And the final policy type, obviously there's all sorts of different policies within these broad categories. But the other one that's common is jurisdictional quotas, and basically saying such and such a jurisdiction has to have at least X amount of wind power or 10% of solar. And so these are actually the most common types of policies you see in the United States right now. And so they're often either through energy certificates or trading or portfolio standards or quota systems. So a few things, if anyone's happened to have read the report, it's in your package there. What's not included is the appendix, and I think that you might be interested in that, where it actually evaluates all the different policies we looked at. It's a really lengthy appendix, but it's probably not included for good reason because it's really long. But it does go through all the different policies in terms of what we looked at. Interestingly, this study was done it's only a year old now, but just going through it in preparation for this talk and just seeing how many of those policies are already superseded and already out of date. When you're doing a study, as you know, in 2009, you're looking at 2008 information, and so we're in 2010 now, and so in that 2-year window, BC's got a new policy, Ontario's a new policy, Nova Scotia has a new policy, the federal government policy has changed, and New Brunswick has put in a new policy. So we've got 5 different policy changes in that 2 years. So that I think speaks to how quickly the industry is evolving and changing. So I just wanted to point that out if you do happen to read this report, that some of it is a bit out of date already. One thing in Canada is very few of the policies really specifically target rural and remote communities. There's a handful, but that is a gap that exists. The policies tend to be broader development oriented. In the United States, you can see this is all of the states that have portfolio standards or have minimum requirements for renewable energy development. And you can see we're getting close to over half of the states have mandates for renewable power. Texas is an interesting one because they had a target of almost 6,000 megawatts of wind power by the year 2015. They're currently at about 9,000 megawatts of wind power. So they exceeded their target many, many years early. In fact, Texas has about 3 times as much wind power as all of Canada does. So there is a whole lot of development going on in the States. So this is an interesting thing to point out for a couple of reasons. One is it's not only seeing sort of the breadth of policies that are going on in the States, but also understanding that this is the market that we're up against in terms of competing for capital, that this has become a big market south of the border.